Good afternoon. Welcome to Planning, Policy Making, and Evaluation with Tracy Cook, who's our lead consultant here at the Montana State Library. I'm Joe Flick. I'm hosting for you today. If you have any problems viewing or hearing the webinar, feel free to send me a note in the chat box and I'll chat with you privately and see if I can help you with any problems you might be having. This session is being recorded this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone and mute everyone's microphone except for Tracy's, and then we'll get started. There you go, Tracy, you're all set.
All right, so can everyone still hear me okay? And you can type in the chat box if you would like. I just know sometimes I have microphone problems. Okay, great. Thanks, Nancy.
Really good.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up the day after a holiday and for this last webinar. And as the slide says, we're going to do planning, policy, and evaluation actually. And just here's my outline. We're going to start with planning, and I realized when I did this I probably should have started with long-range planning during the last webinar because it makes so many of your other duties as library board members easier. So we'll start with that, kind of talking about it, and hopefully some of you may have had experience with this and will share your ideas and thoughts on planning in particular. Then we'll go into evaluating the director and then talking about evaluating the library and setting policy. And my plan, kind of like usual, is to sort of give you my brief, anywhere from 15 to 20-minute overview of each of these topics. Because we do offer trainings about each of these that are much more in-depth and would actually give you a chance to try out some things. So this is more my introduction to each of it. And as always, I hope that you will feel comfortable using the chat box to ask questions or to make comments. Many of you are experienced, as I recall, and you may have some tips you can share with the rest of us. And of course, for those of you who might be a little bit shy about using the chat box, you are welcome to contact me via email or on the phone if you have questions later on. So we'll go ahead and get started and talk about planning. And you know, on the screen I've sort of listed the different types of planning that's out there. I am really going to focus on the long-range planning, which is that big picture visionary stuff. I put 3 to 5 years out, but actually I've seen long-range plans where they even try to go 10 years. Like for instance, the State Library has, it's almost like a vision, how we envision libraries succeeding and Montanans receiving the library services they need. And then we use what we call a short-range plan, sort of 1 to 2 year action plans to try and identify tasks that we need to accomplish in order to reach that vision. Your library may or may not have something like this. What I am just listing are some examples of plans I've seen in other libraries. And planning is good for so many things, but we can spend all of our time planning and none of our time actually doing, and I am going to talk a little bit about that. But first, most of you know how I work, so you're probably not surprised to see me ask you this question: why is planning important? Why do you think it's listed as one of the 6 jobs of the library board? And I would actually include the library director on this. And I'll give you a few moments to type, and I will actually make this where I can edit it so I can actually add your comments to the slide. And I even give you a clue. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, so I'm going to...
And I know it takes a few moments.
That's all right. It does take a few moments, so I'm just going to pop in here. But Tracy is very patient, so don't expect you can just sit back and lurk. This is expected to be interactive.
It's actually my preferred style, so it's really hard to get away from it, even on a webinar. And I liked your comment, Nancy. You don't know where you're going if you don't know how to get there. Oh, I like that. Thanks, Marla. Without a plan, progress is hard to do.
And Alexander had a good comment about it being
And that's
a
very
blueprint.
much.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I missed that one. Thank you, Joe.
It's my job.
Yeah. Excellent. Anyone else want to add? Okay. I will go ahead and save this. Feel free to add to it if you think of something or maybe you're currently typing. While I am actually going through kind of the ones I put down here, I do want to ask you, though, if you would just indicate in the chat box, how many of you have some kind of plan? What I had on the slide that you saw on the screen while I was typing was kind of fundamentally, I think, the responsibility of the director and the board members to meet community needs when it comes to library service and move the library forward. And I think good plans help you do that. And I always tell even the smallest of libraries, which that's primarily where I spend a lot of my consulting time is working with those small libraries, is I think it's important even for them to have some goals. You know, I know they don't have the resources to hire a consultant to come in and lead a long-range planning process, and that's okay. But they should still have some goals for their library, that it's important to take time at least once a year to kind of say, are we meeting our community's needs? Is there something we need to be doing? Is there service we need to be offering? Does our library need a new addition? Just taking that time to think about that's really important because you're stewards of the public library. And your job is to make sure that your community's needs are being met. And also with that moving the library forward, I think people tend to really enjoy doing new things. They really enjoy thinking about the future in many cases and thinking about new services. And so planning can actually be inspiring. And even if you don't have the resources to hire someone, just taking that time to do a simple plan can be very helpful for you and can give you focus. And as you'll see later on, there's a lot of different ways that you can use a long-range plan. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just see what Nancy has to say. Oh, great. I'm glad to see that, Nancy. That's good. And I know like Great Falls Public has one, and I wouldn't be surprised if those of you from Bozeman and Belgrade were either in the process of doing one or have a plan yourselves. So what I want to talk about next is kind of the different planning models. And I really could have labeled this internal and external. You know, it's pretty common sense what each one is. You know, you can choose to just in-house with the director and board members and staff members, create a plan for the library where you sit down and you identify what you want to accomplish. And I don't think any of you would be surprised to read the pros or the cons on that particular type of planning model where you just go internal. It's pretty much what you would expect. And so because of, I think, particularly the cons where the library boards and the directors feel like they need to hear from their community, a lot of the libraries in Montana have chosen to use some kind of community-based model where they invite specific community members to actually participate in a long-range planning process. And they enjoy doing that. It's actually built a lot of goodwill. They get a lot of good ideas because they're inviting people who see the library in a different way. But as you can see, there are cons, of course, to this particular style as well, in that it can be slower and harder, I think, to translate what the community members say to something that the library can truly offer. Which type of model you want to use is entirely up to you and what you want to achieve. And I know some libraries have done the community-based one, and then once they sort of accomplished a lot of what that particular plan said, they move to an internal one the next time, and they just sort of bounce back and forth between the two models, just depending on their needs and what they're trying to accomplish. And that's certainly an option that you have as well. So one of the things I often talk about when I'm working with libraries that are going through the long-range planning process is how can we keep it from ending up on a shelf somewhere or just stuck in our computers, and if we actually ever achieve anything, it's pure luck. And what I recommend that they do is they use that plan to help with all of your other duties that the director and the board have to do. And so I've listed on the screen just some things that you can use a long-range plan for. And while I kind of talk about a couple of these, I thought it would be interesting to just hear if any of you would like to add anything to this, any other ways that you've used a long-range plan. In this particular thing, one of the most effective ways you can use a plan is you use it to actually identify things you want the director to accomplish. And the director might use it for any staff members, and I have seen libraries where board members have actual assignments. You know, for instance, in the long-range plan, they've sort of identified that people don't know what the library can offer or what the library can do. And so the board members actually have on their to-do list that they kind of come up with talking points for the library, and they talk about the library to maybe their county commission or their city councils or other powerful members in the community. So that can be a really great way to make sure that you implement the plan. And it can make evaluating the director easier, as well as evaluating the library itself. You know, if you have something you're supposed to work for, how do you know you got there? And, you know, how well did you get there, and how well are your services doing? A long-range plan can help with both of those. And then in addition, as you can see, it sort of helps with almost all of the other duties that you have on the library board. And I always encourage board members and directors to get that long-range plan out if they have one and look at it during the budget season. You know, our human resources are probably the most important tool we have in achieving things, but most things cost money. And I think it's important that you reflect it in your budget. That's how you can actually achieve certain things. For example, let's say that you identify that you need to remodel your children's room. You're lucky and you have a lot of children in your community and this is a need. Well, you need to somehow reflect in your budget that money is going towards that. It may very well be that you have to do grants, and so your budget shows an income of grants and then an expenditure of this remodel, but it shows up in your budget. And that's actually a very effective way of accomplishing things. Does anyone have any questions about planning or just comments on the process and kind of what you think of it? I just want to pause for a few moments. Okay. So I just want to share with you some planning resources before I move on to the evaluating the director. The trustee handbook does have a very nice section sort of summarizing the long-range plan. In addition, you have myself, Lauren, and Suzanne. And basically, we can come to your library and work with your library board to discuss sort of your options for planning, to help you decide which method you want to use. And we can even facilitate and lead those meetings. I have done several of those types of meetings, both just in-house planning and involving the community. And I know Suzanne has done that as well, and Lauren also. So we are a resource for you, and we can help you with this process if you're kind of intrigued by it and you would like to explore it for your library. In addition, the State Library has a professional development collection with several planning books that you can use. So just ask your director to interlibrary loan these for your library. Basically ask the State Library to send them, and you can review them, and they will give you some ideas for the process as well. So I'm going to pause for a moment because Nancy actually shared some thoughts about the plan as well. So a library needs to reevaluate their plan if new personnel come in because of a new vision. And, you know, that is true. One of the things we did not talk about is how often should you do a long-range plan. And I think the answer is it depends. But if you have new personnel, that's actually a natural time to kind of look at your plan. You also may want to just review it every 3 to 5 years to see if you want to create a new plan. So that's a good point, Nancy. Okay. So during the last webinar, I did give you some homework. Of course, it's been the holidays, but I am hoping that you will share what you might consider the most challenging aspects of evaluating the director. As I mentioned in the last webinar, this is probably the duty I hear the most from board members that they find the hardest. You know, how to evaluate the director, the best way to do that. And I'd be interested in hearing, you know, your thoughts on that. Do you agree with that? And if so, why? If you find it very easy to evaluate your director, I would love to know kind of the method you use and what has worked for your board. And that would be very helpful for the other trustees on this webinar as well. So I'll pause, and I'm going to give you a longer pause, and I know that's uncomfortable, but it's just kind of giving you a chance to add in the chat your own thoughts before I share anything that I have heard from library board members. I know I have a brave soul out there, I'm sure. All right. Thank you. Wonderful. So Kathy says, because of a management agreement we have in place, the city manager actually evaluates me. Oh, interesting. Yes, I believe that Great Falls, there's a couple other libraries in Montana like that where the city manager is the one who evaluates the director. And it's interesting to see that the board was a part of that process. So Ron says, we use the city's form, which is the worst I've ever seen. Do you have one? I have been asked this question a lot, Ron. And in the trustee handbook, there are some examples, but I myself have struggled to find a really good evaluation form. I would, however, if people are interested, I could post the state library's evaluation form, both an older one we used and then the current one we use. I would be happy to do that. People would be interested in seeing that. So Sharon says, not seeing the director do some of the things that are stated on the evaluation form. Those are definitely the top reasons I have heard. I don't think I have found a board member yet who really likes the form that they use to evaluate their director. Okay, I will do that, Gail. And then I also know that trustees feel kind of uncomfortable because it's not like you're in the room with the director seeing what he or she is doing, and that's hard. And also, I think others have indicated that they really find it difficult to, they just don't feel like they have enough knowledge. You know, how do we decide whether or not the director is doing a good job with collection development, if that's part of her duty? And that's actually a very good point as well. So I'm just going to pause because there were actually some really good comments here. So I think it was Nancy said, to evaluate you need a standardized system and a formal form with categories. And Rick is actually getting to what I was trying to say in the strategic planning process, is that using the goals coming out of the strategic plan, that can be very helpful. And I think it makes it easier when you are trying to evaluate the director because it's clear. You know what you need the director to accomplish, and you can evaluate on that. So I'll go ahead and switch, but if any of you do have a method you found successful, please don't hesitate to share it in the chat box, because I know other trustees have indicated to me this is an area they would love to have any tips or ideas. So what I am going to share with you is kind of one way the process can work. When I get called by board members who want help with the evaluation process, a lot of times they're actually calling me at the end of the year. And I tell them that it's not really fair to the director to evaluate him or her if you haven't sat down and told them what you wanted them to accomplish. You know, and so if you're at the end of the year, I say, use a job description, or if you have evaluated, if you have come up with some things you want the director to accomplish, then use those. But I think the best process is at the beginning of the year. The director starts it, and he or she says, this is what I think I need to accomplish in the coming year. And the board and the director together fine-tune that. So the board can add things if they want to, they can take things away. It's a process where you work together. And if you have a strategic plan, that makes it a lot easier for the director to identify some things that he or she needs to achieve. And then throughout the year, the director should be reporting on the progress to the board. And that is a good time for you to find out what's going on, to find out if you're accomplishing your goals, and to ask questions and get ideas. And then at the end of the year, because you've already agreed on what has to be accomplished and hopefully you have a form, you can kind of work through the evaluation. Everyone knows what's expected. So this is kind of a process that I like and that I tend to recommend to board members. I'll be honest, I haven't found the perfect form, but I do feel like this process, and I use it with my employees and then my supervisor uses it with me, actually works pretty well. And we are similar to you in that my employees are in 2 different locations from me and I am in a different location from my supervisor. So we have that same issue that you have. We are not working side by side with our employees. And so this process has been pretty successful for us in getting things done and feeling like it's a fair and neutral process as well. So I'm going to pause for a moment to see what Nancy has to say, and then I am actually going to pull up my work plan so that you can see what one looks like. So Nancy is interested in hearing from others on what they do for evaluation. She'd like to get some ideas about how to improve the process. And I am going to pull up my work plan now so that you can see it. And this is a pretty involved work plan. You know, you don't have to do something like this for your director, but basically it covers the fiscal year. And I started it, and my boss added things to it. And you see, like Goal 1, consultation and leadership tasks. That goal, I shortened it, but basically, if you looked at the State Library's long-range plan, you would see a goal that had those terms in it. And so you can see underneath that, there are things like visit all assigned public libraries. That's a task that I am supposed to accomplish that the thinking is will help us achieve our goal of providing consultation and leadership to public libraries in Montana. So this just kind of gives you an example of something your director could create and you could help with that is very clear-cut. I mean, if you read through this, you know, my supervisor and I can sit down and note whether or not I achieved certain things or I didn't. And as we go through the year, we have, you know, we check in with each other. Like, here's how I'm doing so far. I need more training on this area. You know, I need more resources in this area. We have that give and take going back and forth, which is very helpful for me in achieving what I need to do, and for my supervisor in getting a sense of what it is I am actually accomplishing in the field and whether or not I am achieving the tasks that we both identified in the beginning of the fiscal year, which is what my, as you can see, is what my work plan is. So does anyone have any questions about this process? And I'll go ahead and head back to the PowerPoint here. Just want to see if anyone has any thoughts or comments or a response to Nancy. And before I forget, I'm going to make a note to post our evaluation forms. And I will just post them on that Trustee password-protected website that we have so that you can get access to it. Okay. And, you know, just so you know, for resources, the Trustee Handbook does have a good section about evaluating the director. You also have the resources of your fellow library directors. If any of you go to Federation meetings, that's a really good place to talk to other library directors or trustees about their process and their forms and have they found something that they like that works for them. You also have the MSL consultants as well. And my hope is that maybe, I don't know if it will be a webinar, but I'd like to see us at the State Library develop something about evaluating the director, because I know this is a challenging area. And actually, I think what we develop would be useful for directors in terms of evaluating staff members as well. So I'm just going to pause for a moment because I see there were a couple of comments in the chat box. Oh, Joe says one thing I like to have on my plan is a list of benchmarks for each goal. Yeah, that's a good point, Joe. And maybe actually you would like to elaborate on that a little bit if you don't mind, just kind of talking about what you mean, because I think that might be helpful for the trustees and directors as well. And while Joe's getting ready, so Rick asked, any suggestions on how many goals for the director is adequate? That's a really good question. Yeah, we'll let Joe talk first, and then we'll come back and talk about Rick. That's a great
Rick,
question.
How many? That's a, yeah. One is not enough, and 50 is too many. But between that, that is a really good question. About benchmarks, though, I mean, my point in making that is that I think that as an employee, I like to be able to suggest to my boss how I know I'm making progress. So where my boss may set the goal for me, as the trustees would set the goal for the director should have a say in how they measure and accomplish that goal. And looking at your work plan as an example, Tracy, you'd listed, you see every library. Well, there may be a year when you don't get to see every library, but I see that as kind of a benchmark because it's very, very measurable. You kind of a checklist. You can say, I needed to see these 26 libraries, and I saw 24, and the other 2 I couldn't see for these reasons or whatever. You can easily report on it. That's what I mean when I say a benchmark.
Yep, that is true. And I actually use just a simple Excel spreadsheet to keep track of kind of my work and what I do, so I can easily report on this. So I'm going to, I actually think the benchmark is a very good idea. The other thing I think is just realistically, I don't accomplish everything on my work plan every year. I just don't. Because intentionally, both myself and my boss kind of try to put some things on there that push me, that I may frankly not have the knowledge or the skills to accomplish, but that slowly over time I will gain those skills. And so, for instance, just kind of scrolling down here, you can see that it comes under goal 4, but if you looked at this, you would see that there are actually some training sessions that I am supposed to take that directly relate to my ability to gain the skills I need to do my work. And so you may wish to see that as well. Going back to Rick's comments, I don't think it's easy to answer that. I think it really depends. It depends on the person. It depends on the resources that you have. It depends on, I would say, just kind of the year. Some years your director has time to kind of do a lot of different things. But, for instance, if you have a director or you and your library are going through building an addition, doing a library remodel, maybe even becoming an independent library district, what is going to happen is your director's time is just going to be filled with those duties. And that's a year when, the major goals of the director you might only have 2 or 3, because one of those goals is something that's so big it's taking up a massive amount of the director's time. And so I think that one it's something you and the director have to talk about and I think get a sense of. And that's actually something I feel like I'm getting a little bit better at the longer I'm a supervisor and the more experience I have with my employees, is just getting a sense of what they can do, what's too much, what's too little, and being flexible, being willing to let some things go. Maybe I put a particular goal on the work plan, but it doesn't get achieved, and it's because of a lack of skill or time or resources or something more important has come up. So I think that's just a lot of give and take in terms of how many goals. And to respond to Nancy, I think that's a good question, and I would throw that out to the rest of your fellow students, because, you know, this is my work plan, but it's very different from being a library director. But are there things that a library director should always have on her work plan? Is there something that should always be there? And I hope the rest of you will feel comfortable kind of responding to Nancy's question, because I think it's a good one.
Rick
you guys had some great feedback on this one. Do you have a...
I'm pitching in here that I think one of the things I liked about the work plan and the way it was set up at the State Library when I came to work there was that a standard goal for everybody was what your professional development was going to be for your upcoming year. And so I would argue that one goal that's always good to include for the director is what the board's expectations are for their professional development. And I saw that you had that on yours as well, Tracy.
Yep.
And then Rick had an interesting comment too about prioritizing the goals as well. And that's true. I mean, I've had the same experience you had, Tracy, that, you know, at the end of my first year, I didn't get everything done. And that was on my list. And you really shouldn't. It should always be challenging. And of course, the year changes. You may have something really important that it becomes clear as the year goes on that other things are more important.
Yeah, that's a great point, Joe. And I like what you had to say about adding professional development. You know, and in addition to that is the expectation that library directors be certified. So I think that's pretty important to include that one. And Rick, you're right. You should prioritize goals. And I don't know if anyone noticed, but there were certain things on my work plan that had an asterisk beside them. And those are things that my boss and I want me to achieve by the end of the year. They are priorities that I am supposed to be doing. So I think that's very important. And I think it takes more work to do it this way, where at the beginning of the year the board and the director work together. But I think what you end up with is a much more thoughtful and meaningful process. And that's what I like about this particular process and the development of a work plan and the kind of checking in throughout the year, and then the final where you kind of talk about what you achieved and what you didn't and why you didn't achieve those things. And it feels much more like development, which I think is sort of the highest purpose of evaluating the director. Is like it's really about you improving and developing your skills. And that's what I like about this process, is it's about that. It's not just sort of a form that we check off to accomplish things. So yeah, you guys had lots of really good questions and comments. Please feel free to keep them coming. I will go ahead, though, and move out of evaluating the director and into talking about evaluating the library. And this is, I think, a very important job of the director and the library board, and I'd much rather you be the ones to do this and to do your homework on this than to be surprised by something someone says or does that's kind of negative for the library. And this is very much my sort of 5-minute evaluating the library. You know, you can see on the screen the kinds of questions that I am thinking of you answering. But the one question you don't see on here that I think is critically important is why. And when I go through the example of some of the reports you can run, I'll talk about the why in a little bit more detail. But basically, you know, you really want to use both qualitative and quantitative data. I do want to emphasize that. And the thing I'd like to say about qualitative data is, in my observation, I think all of us in our work areas, no matter where we work, sometimes we come to a point where we wonder what good we're doing and if we're even doing good. And this is a place where patron and staff feedback can be so helpful. It's true it can be negative, but a lot of times it's very positive, and I think that's important for directors and staff members to hear that, to kind of hear that good feedback and hear how they do good things for people. Obviously, if there's negative feedback, then you have to deal with that, but a lot of times it turns out to be a very positive experience, and it's that little pat on the back that I think most of us need to continue kind of at the work that we do. In addition to qualitative data, which can be gathered through surveys or talking to patrons and staff directly, or even focus groups if you have that luxury and ability in your library, you actually can use some quantitative data, and I'm going to go visit this website right now. Your public library directors are required each year to submit of statistics to the state library. And we, in return, actually send those to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We receive federal funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And they use these numbers to make a case for continued funding for libraries. We use them at the state level for that same purpose. We also use them, for instance, in a document we create for state legislators. So legislative session is here. You know, all of our state representatives actually received a document that talked about what libraries do, and particularly libraries in their community. And all of that comes from this data. What Stacy Brune, who is, I call her our staff person extraordinaire, did is she's in charge of the statistics, and she's also really good with programming. So she has created for you an online site where you can run reports for your library. You can compare your library over time. You can compare it to other libraries in the state, and I'll scroll down here. You can also compare your libraries to other libraries around the nation. It's pretty amazing what you can find on here. I'm just going to run a few reports for you so you can see what they look like and to give you a sense of the kinds of information you can find. But I really strongly encourage you to play around on this site. I certainly think directors should take a look at it, and even board members, it might not hurt, to just kind of use this as a way to evaluate your library and how it's doing. So for instance, let's just take a look at the historical report, and I'll choose the Choteau County Library. And basically, let's say I want to see their circulation over time. That's a question I've heard board members ask, and I think it's a very good one. How has our usage of the library changed over time? So I'm going to click on this. And what we're going to see on the screen is a chart. And the years go from, I believe, 1999 to 2011. And this is kind of all about usage of the library and their circulation over time, as you can see here. One of the things I'll say is some of us, you know, like myself, might be really comfortable with the numbers, but some of you might be more visual. And so I'm actually going to go back, and thank you, Joe, for posting the link. And I'm going to click on this charts, historical comparisons. And I'll click on this single element, the very first one. And you can see this process you'll see throughout. It's usually 3 steps. And so I'll choose a chart form, and I'm actually going to choose line. And I'll choose a chart type, and let's say I want to see circulation. That's what I'm interested in. And I have to scroll down to the bottom, and these are basically what you're seeing on the screen. These are all the statistics your library has to give to us. So you can see this is like when statistics are due, that's a really good time to bring your director chocolate or flowers. So we're going to choose library, and I'll choose the Choteau County Library again, since that's who we looked at, and we'll click go. And I have a feeling a lot of you will look at this and be like, that's way easier for me. There's something about seeing it visually that's very helpful for us. So as you can see with this particular library, you know, they've seen basically steady usage from here on out. Looks like the year's about 2001. And so as a board member, you know, I might ask, well, what is this? They went from 78 to 104, and why? That's always a good one. Do they have a new branch they added? Did one of their branches go online? There's all kinds of questions that you might ask about this. I might also ask, why are we seeing these steady increases? What are we doing right so that we can keep doing that? If you see a decrease like this, you want to ask the question, why do we see that decrease? You know, what happened in that particular time that our circulation went down kind of by that much? So these are the kinds of things that I like to show these reports, just kind of get you thinking about how your library is doing and why it's doing well, why it's not doing well, what you can do differently. This is only one piece of evaluating your library. You know, you take this with kind of patron feedback and other things that you're looking at to really identify how your library is doing. But I think it's important to take a look at these and to talk about them and talk about what they mean. So let me go ahead and go back. And I'll scroll up to the top and actually click on Reports. And I hope I'm going slowly enough because I know there's often a little bit of a delay. And the last one I'm actually going to click on is just Custom Reports and Charts. And I like to show this one to kind of talk about how things are related. For instance, if you're looking at your library's circulation, there are a lot of factors that determine your library's circulation. Do people in your community read? Some communities use the library as a public space. It's less about reading than about being able to connect with their fellow friends and family members. But others, the communities read, so they have higher circulation. You know, another factor is, are you ordering the items people want to read? That determines circulation as well. Both of those things are qualitative, but there are some other things that might determine circulation, like how many items you have. What hours are you open? Are you open when people can actually go to the library and check out a book? What percentage of your community has a library card? Those things are all related. And so that's why I like this custom reports and charts. And I click on multiple fields, and I've actually recommended that libraries do this. And there's a report year. It's almost always 2011 or the latest report year, so I'm going to leave that. The second step is to choose a report field, and I'm going to uncheck this under automation. And I'm just going to go down here, and we're going to click on total circulation. I want to know the total collection, so how many items do we have, because I think that impacts circulation. You know what? I think also what we spend on materials, that also really impacts circulation as well. And then let's just go ahead and I'll scroll down, and I'm going to choose the percent of people who registered borrow means they have a library card, basically. So I'm going to choose the percent registered, and I'll scroll all the way down here. Actually, I'm going to go back up, and I'm going to choose hours open, since I mentioned that one as well. And we're going to choose libraries, and just to make it easier to read, I'm going to choose a population group, and I'll choose over 25,000, since we have Bozeman and Great Falls on the line. And so this report runs, and here's what we have displayed. And so you can take a look at your library and compare it to other libraries. Sometimes, in all honesty, it's helpful to have the population, because just because you're in the big library population, you know, like Bitterroot, I think only has about 26,000 people versus Missoula and Billings, which are much larger. But you could run this for just your library, but you can also run it for libraries of the same size, where you can literally compare the numbers. You know, how does your collection look? How about what you spend on materials compared to the other libraries? And I've heard of library directors who have been able to get more funding for their library because they use this report to show that they had the lowest amount of money for materials. And so there are all kinds of things that you can do with these reports that can be very helpful for your library, in addition to just evaluating how you're doing. So I'm going to pause for a moment and go back to the PowerPoint. And while I'm doing that, please don't hesitate to use the chat to ask any questions, or let me know if you have any suggestions as well. And I'll just pause for just a few moments to give people time to type. And you can, if you've thought of a question about an earlier topic, feel free to put it in the chat box as well.
Might also be interested in if anyone has been using these statistics in a way that's been really helpful, and you're willing to share that, that would be great to add into the chat box as well.
Yes, it would. Thanks, Joe. Probably one of the main questions I get from library board members and directors is often, what are other libraries doing? So, okay. Well, I will go ahead then and go to the very last duty.
Well, Alexander did post that he thought it was pretty great information. So
Thanks, Alexander. All right. So let me ask you this, because of course I'm going to make you type in the chat box again. What are policies? You know, I imagine even those of you who are fairly new on the library board have had a library policy that you've had to approve or update. So what exactly are they? And I'll just pause for a few moments. And feel free to answer why you think we need them at the same time.
that's a very simple question with a very complicated answer.
Yes, it is. It's true. It's a lot easier when you can talk, actually, because you can kind of answer it and take less time than typing. But I thought I'd pause just in case anyone would like to sort of add their thoughts.
And someone will be brave enough, I think.
They will. This is a good group. They're willing to chat, or they've gotten used to my style. So Kathy, yep, guidelines for operation that ensure consistent treatment of all. And Nancy has policies for disaster growth, disruptive patrons. Yep. Examples are always good. I thought I'd just wait a few moments in case some of you are typing at the same time. All right. Kathy actually summed it up very well. Policies are guidelines. And why do we need them? Well, there are a variety of reasons why we need them. She mentions consistent treatment, and that's a big one. You know, usually we have policies to ensure that we're treating everybody equitably and fairly and consistently. The other reason we need policies is for most libraries, there's pretty much, it's a simple supply and demand problem. For instance, we set limits on computer usage. A lot of times that happens because we don't have enough computers for everyone who wants a computer. And we may not have enough computers for a lack of funding, or it may be even a lack of space. But what it comes down to is patrons kind of argue with each other about using the computer, or some patrons don't get to use the computer because others are monopolizing it. And so we end up having to create a policy because we simply don't have enough supply to meet the demand. And so a lot of times I describe a policy as the place where you're balancing the resources the library has with people's wants and needs. Other reasons that we have policies and we need them make the library more enjoyable for others. You know, for instance, Nancy mentioned a disruptive patron policy. You know, a little kid running through the library screaming, that could be cute for some people, but for a lot of people that would be pretty distracting and disturbing. The other reason I think we have policies sometimes is safety issues. You know, it's just a matter of that same child running through the library. While it might be cute, there's probably a danger there. And so we end up having a policy about kids not running through the library and screaming, as much for their own safety as well as for the enjoyment of others. And really, I think that too comes down to that, balancing the library's resources and space with our community's wants and needs. So I'm going to pause for a moment and see what Nancy had to say. And I think this is a really good point, what Nancy had to say about help set the plan of where the library is headed, similar to our goals. Depending on sort of, I guess, what you would call the vision for your library, your policies should match that. And some of your policies are going to be related to the things that you want to achieve. All of this is pretty much interconnected. I'll go ahead and flip to the next slide about sort of the process, but if anyone has anything they would like to add, please feel free to do that, or if you have any questions. So this is just one particular process that you can use. You don't have to use this process. Typically what I find is that the idea of updating a policy or creating one starts with the director, because he or she is usually there on the ground floor and seeing what's happening and seeing that they need to have a policy. But the first question I actually challenge directors and board members to ask is, do we need this policy? And the reason I say that is because policies always have consequences. And sometimes they're obvious. You know, if a patron's disruptive, they're asked to leave the library. That's an obvious consequence. But sometimes policies have unintended consequences. And it's that old cliche, you end up punishing the many for the sins of the few. And so it's really important to actually ask, do you need this policy? Because there will always be those kinds of consequences when you create a policy. Sometimes they're very minor, sometimes they're not. And so the kind of the things I ask directors and board members to consider are, you know, whatever this issue is that you're looking at, does it happen a lot? Or is this a one-time only deal, or only rarely does it happen? If the answer is it's a one-time only deal, you're responding to something negative that happened, and you don't deal with it very often, I would actually question whether or not you need a policy. In all honesty, your staff is probably not going to remember the policy if it doesn't happen very often, and you may end up inconveniencing others just to respond to this rare event. If you are talking about something that happens every day, then that's a good candidate for a policy. And the example of the computer usage, that's a good one. You know, I remember when I was a library staff member and how challenging it was as people kind of fought over the computers and usage of them. I was very grateful for a library policy that kind of said, you get 1 hour a day and that's it. That was helpful because I faced that issue every day, multiple times a day. That's a good candidate for a policy. Something that I only face once every 5 years or very rarely, that's probably not a good candidate for a policy. So I think it's really important to ask if you need that. If the answer is yes, then on the screen I've listed some of the things you should think about. The one I will highlight is brainstorm alternatives and define negative and positive consequences of each. You know, if you think about usage of the computers and just time limits alone, you could have no time limit, you could have 15 minutes, you could have 30 minutes, you could have an hour. There's all kinds of things you can do. One of the things I think is really important is to talk about each alternative and sort of the good points about it and the bad points about it. And from that, identify the alternative that's kind of, I think, going to be the most effective, meaning it will serve people the best, it will do the best job of balancing our library's resources with what people want without making them jump through unnecessary hoops. So this is sort of my suggestion for the policy development process, and I'll be curious to see if anyone has any comments or thoughts on this particular process. I'll give you a few moments just to see if anyone wants to add anything to the chat box before I switch to the next slide.
And Tracy, this is something when you get into policy that has to be open to the public as well, the discussion about a policy, right?
Yeah, actually everything the board does except for evaluating the director and if they are involved in a lawsuit with a private individual must be open to the public. And you know, a lot of times I see committees where the director, a staff member, and a board member works on the policy. Those aren't required to meet open meeting laws, but the discussion the board has when the policy is presented to them absolutely must be open to the public. And I know of some libraries who are very open, and they actually list when their committees are having meetings in case people want to attend. So I'm going to pause for a moment. A policy has to be flexible and occasionally reevaluated to see if it's effective or workable. Yes, Nancy, that is absolutely critical. You know, it's important for you to review your policies, and I know that that can be less than exciting, but it's important to do that because things change. People change, times change, technology changes. For all of those reasons, you need to come back to a policy and say, is this still a good idea? Do we need to change this? It's a very good point. So at the end of this process, when you fine-tune it and present it to the full board, there's a question that I always challenge board members and directors to ask after they've read the draft of the policy, and it's this. What does this policy say about our library? Policies are kind of the sleepers of libraries. They just seem like a document you create, but in reality, a lot of times they affect the atmosphere of your library. There's a lot of things that make a library welcoming. The people who work there, the way the library is set up, but believe it or not, the library's policies also impact that. Because some policies, if you read them, they almost seem to say, don't use our library. And other policies seem to say, you're welcome here, we're so happy to serve you. And your staff are implementing those policies. So if you have a policy that sort of is on that, don't use our library, that's what people sense when they use your library because of the way your policies are written. And so I think it's important to ask that question after you read the policy. It's almost like there's a continuum. And on one end you have things like the Historical Society libraries who have rare and unusual materials, and their job is to protect those materials. And on the other end of the continuum you might have a library that's all about the customer service and the public. They don't require ID for a library card, they have minimum policies. You're not surprised, most libraries fall kind of in the middle, which is fine. But what I'm challenging you to do when you have a policy presented to you is to read it as if you were a member of the public, and to ask yourself, what does this say about us, and is that a good thing? Is that what we want this policy to say? Does it say welcome? We're happy to have you in the library. We want to make this a good experience for everyone. Or does it kind of actually say it's going to be easier for you to buy a car than to get a library card? And that's kind of what I'm talking about with this particular question, and why I ask board members and directors to kind of read a policy with this in mind. So I'll just pause for a moment. We'll see if anybody has any comments on this one. Okay. So the 4 tests of a good policy. I hope that none of you ever end up in a court of law where a library patron has sued you about a particular policy the library has. But if they do, you want to make sure that your policy, basically you can answer yes to these 4 questions. They're pretty straightforward. The first one, is it legal? If it's against any local, state, or federal laws, you're probably not surprised to hear the judge is going to throw that policy out and the patron would win. Is it fair? This is about the punishment fits the crime. So for instance, you should not have harsh punishments if the patron violates your policy. If I have an overdue book, banning me from the library forever, that's harsh punishment. Making me pay a fine, a small fine, that's not. That's acceptable. So make sure that your policy is fair, that you're not exacting some kind of horrible punishment if a patron violates your policy. The policy needs to be clear and concise, and what this means is that the patron understands what is going to happen if they violate some rule that the library has. But I think the flip side of that is your staff knows what they are supposed to do if a patron is violating a policy. So it's really important that your policy is clear and concise. You know what you're supposed to do, you know what you're not supposed to do. It also needs to be consistent. And an example of this one is it's pretty common in libraries for staff members to not have to pay fines. But once you get beyond staff members, you're almost creating classes of people. So it's not acceptable that staff members and spouses and friends of the library and board members and friends of board members don't have to pay fines. When you do that, you are actually creating different classes of people, and the court system frowns on that. They really want to see that you're consistent. Basically, the policy applies to everybody, and that's what that particular issue is about. Does anyone have any questions about policies or anything we've covered? Because we are actually to the end, and I see I only have a couple minutes.
Yep, we're approaching the top of the hour.
All right, well, I'll go ahead and do this, and I'll stay on the line in case anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask. Thank you to all of you who attended these. I appreciate that you took the time out of your day to join me for this. And please do contact me if you have any questions, and if you have any suggestions for improving these trustee webinars or any topics you would like us to focus on in the future, please let either Joe or myself know.
By all means, we'd love to hear from you. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. Thanks for those of you who have tuned in, and you'll have Tracy's contact information there on the screen. You certainly do get credit for your attendance even if it is online, so be sure to go on to the CE tracking form and claim your credit. So.